Hello, welcome to this Lit in 5 video on The Handmaid's Tale, a walkthrough of chapters 20 to 25 inclusive. These are slightly different compared to the usual format of videos. These are walkthroughs rather than being focused on the 5 areas of language, form and structure, context, etc, etc. Coming up after this slide is an 8-minute discussion of the key areas that I'm exploring in these walkthroughs of the Handmaid's Tale chapters. If you've seen this before on one of the other videos, it would make sense to maybe skip through that for about 8 minutes and then get onto the analysis coming through. Okay, hope you find this useful. If you do, please add some likes, please add some comments, please subscribe to the channel, give me some feedback and interaction. Hope this is very useful for you. Okay, I'm going to introduce 5 key areas of interest. I won't call them themes. Themes isn't very A-level-y in terms of analysis, but these are 5 important areas which will explain the walkthrough of the next few slides and also give you some key areas to focus your reading. The first one is obviously power. So we're in a dystopian novel. That's the key sort of issue in terms of genre and context. So in dystopian novels you always tend to have a totalitarian regime, Big Brother, Oceania, all these kinds of things in different dystopian novels. Here obviously we have the Gilead regime. So it's pretty conventional that those in power are powerful, that goes without saying, but are oppressive and sort of extremely limiting of people's freedoms. However, it would be a mistake not to think that there are forms of challenge to this power. In The Handmaid's Tale, it's not radical. There's no one who rises up and overthrows Gilead on a Wednesday or anything like this. The main area of challenge and resistance to this comes in the form of Offred's narrative, most specifically, as I'll talk about later, him memories. So again, that's not massive revolution and an uprising and an armed overthrowing of a government or a regime, but as we'll go through in some of these clips now, we will see that Offred's memory and her thoughts are the major way in which the Gilead regime and its new right Christian ideology can be challenged. Our second area, which I explore and link the quotes to, is number 2, dystopian tropes. So tropes, the ingredients, the conventions of dystopian literature, particularly if you're doing AQA and you're doing Margaret Atwood as a single text, you need to refer to things like typicality, so conventions of other dystopian works or the genre as a whole work really well. In relation to The Handmaid's Tale, one of the main ones is the attempt to control identity and to prescribe and limit or reduce identity, and also to control thoughts. So we're in classic Orwellian territory there. So the handmaids, particularly Offred, our narrator, her identity is policed and controlled. The Gilead regime will be more than happy to have Offred think of herself as nothing more than a reproductive vessel serving the greater good of the Christian aims of repopulating the world. However, Offred's memories prevent that. She's often very cynical and sees through the hypocrisy of the Gilead regime, so therefore resisting their attempts to control her mind and her thoughts and to maintain an identity of her previous self, of her current self, and occasionally harbours some thoughts of her future self. Number 3, the walkthrough will identify quotes and moments in these chapters and the novel as a whole where we see the importance of memories. And we're raising the idea, use a technical term of palimpsestic juxtaposition. You'll see that referenced as pal-juxta on the top of each of the forthcoming slides as I go through certain quotes from each chapter. So a palimpsest, it is mentioned in the novel, it's layer upon layer. Almost like transparency films where you can see the previous layer of detail poking through the current or the uppermost layer of detail. We have a lot of that in terms of juxtaposition. So Offred will see things in the now, the shop, which currently sells meat or certain vegetables, and her memory and her mind will wander back to what this shop was previously. For example, a cinema or a lingerie shop in certain memories she has. This might sound small scale, but it is one of the ways in which Offred can assert power, number one, and resist that dystopian trope of trying to alter and control thought and the mind and identity of their subjects. So, very important when we get instances of that, and memory and thoughts of the past are a massive part of Atwood's novel. Obviously we have Big Brother trying to control and rewrite history in Orwell's great novel. Similar ideas at work here, but this is the main way in which Atwood's narrator resists that. Number 4, you'll see moments where I link quotations from these chapters to the demonstration of new right ideology. So this kind of hardline right-wing Christianity, the Republican Party if you're in America, conservative with a large C if you're in England. Obviously all this stuff, as you've been going through the novel, is horribly very topical again in the world of Trump and all these kinds of ideologies emerging now. Abortion has recently been banned in certain states again. So I'll flag up moments where Offred refers to that, or Atwood has Offred refer to that. A lot of time in the narrative, Atwood uses Offred to identify this, to then have her narrator identify the hypocrisies in this Christian ideology. So in the same way we have Donald Trump would profess himself a Christian now, groups would also challenge how Christian is it to force rape victims to go through and have a full-term pregnancy of a baby they never wanted through sexual assault. So quite frequently this is included for Atwood to critique the hypocrisies of this through her narrator. And finally, something which cuts across all of these other 4 themes, the roles of women. So, as we've mentioned, being reduced to biological functions, biological and reproductive determinism. They're portioned up in terms of colours, of course, Econo wives, so allotted certain roles. But also, don't forget the characters of Aunt Lydia and Serena Joy, who are obviously women, and although they embody the dystopian trope of a totalitarian power or regime, there are moments which we identify as well in some of the quotes where Atwood has you consider those 2 women as also prisoners, as also having their lives restricted in terms of the dystopian regime they belong to, and whose values they have to uphold, be seen to uphold. I think Aunt Lydia actually does fully believe and is fully committed to it. But yeah, definitely the possibility to consider them as also or partial prisoners of this Gilead dystopian regime. Okay, you'll see these 5 areas at the top of each page now as we go through certain moments and certain quotations from this bank of chapters. So without any more waiting, let's move on to... Okay, moment here from chapter 20. These next few chapters circulate around the idea of Janine giving birth. Just in yellow here, I liked this really sort of paradoxical phrasing here that Atwood has Offred use. So Janine inflated because of her pregnancy, but reduced. So look at the antithesis of that to go and create an interesting paradox. Inflated but reduced, shorn of her former name. So a little reminder of her past there, and that typical sort of dystopian trope of identity being erased or controlled then erased. I like the verb shorn as well. Shorn can be seen as hinting towards that idea of shaving a woman's hair, or shaving her head, shaving all her hair off, if thought to be an adulteress. So a very sort of grotesque and medieval punishment as the crime that went with being a female adulterer. Now that's obviously nothing to do with hair, and Janine Standing is about to be improved, isn't it, by having a baby. But it's interesting, her former name, her past identity, is linked to that verb shorn, as though it's a disgraceful thing to be ashamed of, to be covered up and banished and judged in this sort of new Christian ideology. Sorry, new right Christian ideology. Next quote, here's Aunt Lydia with more of her propaganda, more of her ideology, very sort of useful dystopian terms. "You are a transitional generation," said Aunt Lydia. "It is hardest for you. We know the sacrifices you are being expected to make." And then on she goes. They, the future generation, the ones who will come after you, will accept their duties with willing hearts. So this is very sort of typical of totalitarian regimes. They assume compliance and obedience from those they rule over. However, in this sort of novel, and we'll come to the stuff in yellow in a moment, shows that you can try all you wish as a totalitarian regime to control and prescribe and limit. Rebellion is instinctive in mankind. I don't mean that in a gendered term. In humanity, in the face of attempts to control. I think that's one of the things a lot of dystopian novels show. Don't think about this, only think about this. No, I can, sometimes because of the edict or command to not think about this or only think about this, our mind rebels. It is intrinsic in human nature. So I think that's something which tends to undermine a lot of dystopian regimes and totalitarian regimes in dystopian fiction. No matter your attempt to control, there is something inherently rebellious in the human spirit which goes against that. Just to prove that point, look at the stuff in yellow. She did not say, because they will have no memories of any other way. She said, because they won't want things they can't have. So, very important again from Offred to do with power. Again, it's not massive, it's not revolutionary, but there's Offred resisting Aunt Lydia's ideology, as you can see in the box over there. And that very dystopian thing of erasing, controlling, doctoring, policing, any of those verbs you want to use, history. There's the Orwell quote there, which I'm pointing now. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. But more of that particular quote in a moment. But there it is in that current quote. Because they will have no memories of any other way. Importance of memories is resistance, you see. Okay, our next quote here, which I'm not going to read out because it is deeply unpleasant. So without getting into the sort of sexual politics of porn as a medium and film as a medium in terms of how it represents women, that's an entirely different argument for a different day. We'll zoom in here on the yellow stuff, which is Aunt Lydia. Consider the alternatives to life before Gilead is what she's saying here. Consider the alternatives in contrast to the wholesome purity of Gilead now. Again, there are millions of hypocrisies we can explore and will do later. This is the key line here. You see what things used to be like. So it's very tempting in the era of Trump now to use the term fake news. I'm not so sure whether that's going to be applicable in your essay, but Trump or not, what we're getting at here again is very Orwellian in terms of doctoring and colouring or contorting the past to suit the agenda of the totalitarian regime in the present. So, it's impossible to say with 100% certainty, but I think Atwood is very much encouraging us to see this as not historical reality, as implied by Lydia's phrase, how things used to be like. I do think Lydia is trying to pass this off as historical reality, like documentary footage almost, when weirdly, looking back, as it's someone who was a child of the 80s, this is fiction, but by all, to all extents and purposes. There was a genre called video nasties, and if you look at sort of 80s, I think it's called the slasher flick, You'd see kind of bits being chopped up and mutilated and stuff. For some reason, this was huge in the 80s. It's a miracle anyone turned out reasonably balanced in their sanity when this sort of stuff was floating around as popular entertainment. Good lord. But very Gileadian there, very typical of totalitarian regimes, the attempt to control history, which is why I've put that Orwell quote there. But you could use that at so many points throughout this novel in terms of your context and your typicality. So yeah, we're seeing pornography, we're seeing horror films being passed off as historical realism. Very important, of course, that Moira, along with Offred, can see through this. Moira said later it wasn't real. It was done with models, but it was hard to tell. Okay. Then you get a second bit of footage that the Gileadians are using to indoctrinate, control and shape thoughts. Remember what we said earlier, though? That is never guaranteed to be 100% successful. There is that inherent rebelliousness in mankind, I think. Now, the Unwoman documentary here is footage of a feminist campaign or protest. So, language, power and ideology. Feminists now have been relabelled. They have been rebranded and controlled in terms of their historical significance and identity as unwoman. So they are against what is natural for women, because they did not conform to the marry, breed, follow the word of the Christian faith, etc., etc. So these are monstrous, or being depicted as monsters by the Gileadian regime. If you're not familiar with sort of new right or conservative ideologies and you're not great on your politics, then obviously Atwood does not like it at all. So there's bias here, deliberately, consciously. But look at these two moments here. Back then, the unwomen were always wasting time. That label of wasting time will mean not in employment, not bringing children into the world, not obeying the word of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, etc., etc. They were encouraged to do it. The government gave them money to do that very thing. So this chimes perfectly, horribly, with your objections of your Nigel Farages and all these kinds of people in the world today. So this is getting towards the idea of claiming benefits. So you can see this new right disgust and dislike of, oh my goodness, money is being given to fund unproductivity and to protest and not be Christian. So you can see how the Gileadians would spin this as we needed to intervene. We needed to put the world back on the correct, in inverted commas, cause of Christianity, procreation, etc., etc. Okay, so there's your new right dislike of protesting women, or any kind of protest at all. I've just started watching Stranger Things 3, and the mayor at the start of that's obviously set in 1984, 1985. There's something about that period, isn't there? So many writers are re-examining it now and revisiting it in their fictions and their stories as a time of sort of dystopian horror. Very interesting. And he just sent all the protesters away who were protesting against the mall being built. So clearly our new right and our conservatives do not like voices that challenge them. They prefer to silence them, make them go away, and make them go away in some very unpleasant ways at times too. I've only just started season 3, so I don't know how that's going to end. Not very well, one imagines. In a dystopian context, consider the irony here of, what have we got? So, but they were godless, and that can make all the difference, don't you agree? So look at that sort of tag question added on the end of Moira's sort of ideology and Lydia, beg your pardon, Lydia's propaganda and ideology. Do the handmaids have any potential to disagree? Of course they don't. Okay, they might do inwardly in their thoughts, very, very different and still very important, but they couldn't put their hand up and say, actually, Aunt Lydia, I think you're grossly misrepresenting the feminist movement of the late 1970s and blah, blah. They'd be probably strung up on the wall for doing so, wouldn't they? So, no joking about that, of course, but in a way, it's sort of ridiculous that Lydia, or Atwood has Lydia, have that tag question on the end of a sort of diatribe and attempt to ideologically control. By pure coincidence and accident, this documentary shows Offred footage of her mother, my young mother. Younger than I remember her, as young as she must have been once before I was born. She's wearing the kind of outfit Aunt Lydia told us was typical of women in those days. Overall jeans with a green and mauve plaid shirt, which evokes the extremely important feminist icon of Rosie the Riveter. There she is in all her powerful glory. So I guess we've got to consider what Atwood might be hinting towards here. In some ways, it's a stereotype of what the era would have seen a feminist as, in order to dress this way. No sort of pretty in pink, flowery, frilly skirts, redefining and challenging the notion of what it means to be female and feminine. But yet again here we have the power of memories and history. In a chapter where we have Janine and female success and worth being defined in that sort of biological reductionism of you're only a success if you manage to breathe and produce a healthy baby. We have these attempts by Lydia to doctor and demonise what was feminism in the past as an unwoman. It does not have the effect that the Gilead regime desires. Instead, ideas of independence and striking out from under a patriarchal shadow or oppression is being reminded and evoked. Look at that in terms of the following simile. So we have more of the documentary here, and the camera pans up and we see the bedsheet with the painting on it, Take Back the Night, which is in reference, I believe, to whether it is safe or not for women to walk the streets at night due to sort of threats and sort of sexual predators and whatnot. So there they are, striking a very, very necessary and important note in terms of women should be free to walk the streets at night. They should not be worrying about increased risks of danger because of the awful behaviour of certain men. So that's what the campaign is about. But with the evoking of this idea of being a woman from a previous age as a campaigning feminist, this simile is very important. The women around me breathe in. There's a stirring in the room like a wind over grass. So the simile here has caused a reawoken memory of what female resistance was. So I think again it's had the opposite effect. Lydia is trying to use this to demonise previous notions of what being a woman is, but the opposite effect has been caused here. This next quote in green, it's not particularly revealing or of anything deeper or significant, but I just think it's a perfect quote to illustrate the idea to an examiner, or if you're using it in coursework, of what a palimpsest is and how and why Margaret Atwood is using them in this novel for the idea of resistance and to challenge. Behind this sign, there are other signs. So, see this building as the Pravaganza shop? Actually, no, I know what it used to be previously. See this shop as Old Flesh? Actually, no, I remember of what it was previously. It's just a perfect 7-word quote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yes. Behind this sign, there are other signs. And thankfully, because there are other signs behind this current sign, contributes to Gilead not being able to have total and complete control and takeover over minds and identity. Okay, the actual signs, the other signs behind this sign, is in blue here. And I think this is very, very deliberate by Atwood. You have women together in the one place campaigning against or with competing and different ideologies. So the first one is freedom to choose. That's pro-abortion. The second one is every baby a wanted baby. That's anti-abortion and very in keeping with new right ideology. And then so on and so forth. I think the idea here is that you are seeing, as you can see on the screen, clashing and dissenting voices. Margaret Atwood, possibly her values underneath this, I don't know, I've never met her. I'm going to see her soon, so I might be able to ask her. This is as life should be in a utopian democracy. You should be able to peacefully have competing voices without trying to eradicate and eliminate the opposing voices. However, in a theistic dystopia, you see the elimination of these. You see competition and challenges as being eradicated. They want compliance and behaviour. Again, think of that in terms of Mr. Trump in the current climate. So you'll see hundreds of balloons rise here. They're strings, red balloons. It's hard not. Well, you are invited to do palimpsestic juxtaposition there, aren't you? Red balloons. You're meant to sort of draw a parallel with the now, of the fact that these handmaids are defined by the colour red. Balloon, I guess, gets towards the imagery of intangibility related to their identity again. A balloon is air, essentially, contained within a small piece of plastic, vinyl, rubber. I'm not sure what a balloon's made of, my apologies. But that's what women have been reduced to now, or certainly the handmaids have been reduced to now. So that was almost like a foreshadowing, if you like. However, look at this sign here with a circle painted on them. I'm just drawing it on the screen now. A circle with a stem, like the stem of an apple. The stem is a cross. So there's your symbol for the female gender. I'll draw the male one as well, just so you're aware of them. However, whilst it is true to say that the symbol or the image which comes under the circle is part of the symbol for the female gender, I think the idea of it being a cross is very satirical and significant here. So the idea of Christianity, in terms of the cross, that powerful symbol of the Christian faith, taking over, controlling or defining the image, female identity, is the point that Atwood is starting to make here. So you are seeing now, when Trump allowed certain states to ban abortion again, you saw a lot of, and rightly so in my opinion, on social media, of stop letting these 20 old white men in a boardroom determine what is wrong or right for our young female bodies. You may be aware of such campaigns on social media and whatnot, but there is a powerful satirical little moment of symbolism which shows how religion controls, or this form of religion, the new right Christian ideology, defines, controls, limits, polices, depends how strong you think Atwood is being, destroys female identity. Then we get back on Earth, below the balloons. My mother is part of the crowd now, and I can't see her anymore. So, is that Atwood? I'll pose this as a question, see what you think. Is that Atwood lamenting, really, really sad and, woefully miserable about the fact that such voices are being discouraged in the 1984-85 of her releasing the book and the years before? Is that a loss that the new right is trying to eradicate and remove and demonise such forms of protest? Okay, so chapter 21. I guess most of the things we're going to talk about here talks about this particular quote, "We are no longer single." So Janine's in the throes of pain and labour, bless her, and there's this sense of, a word I'm going to point out here, homogeneity, all the same. So in some senses that can be solidarity, but in a dystopian novel, we're looking at here the erasure of individuality. So your individuality, your identity is rendered almost into oblivion, really. It doesn't exist. You are part of a group. You have your role, your designated role, and that determines your identity. So here are the handmaids being very supportive of Janine. One of the women kneels and rubs her back. We, you're going to see that pronoun a lot here, we are all good at this. We've had lessons. So there's that conditioning, there's that training, there's that shaping and limiting of female identity here, in the sense that they exist. Well, it's give me children or else I die, to use that quote which Gilead frequently reuse from the Bible to ideologically condition the handmaids. This bit's also interesting here as well. The soft chanting envelops us like a membrane. So even the way Offred describes this togetherness is saturated in a birth sort of language or birth imagery. So that simile there, like a membrane, you might see that as referring to kind of the amniotic sac. They are all sharing the womb, if you like, whilst helping Janine give birth to this current baby. Don't forget the idea of homogeneity here harks back to a previous chapter where Atwood has had Aunt Lydia, I think it is, occupying her time with the hobby of knitting, and she's doing that sort of daisy chain of people. So there's that sort of symbolic foreshadowing, really, and satirical symbolism of how a dystopian regime seeks to sort of erase individuality. So you are all citizens of the government. It doesn't matter whether you're a black citizen, an Asian citizen, a female citizen, an LGTB citizen, it doesn't matter. You are citizens. And again, that's dystopian and nightmarish. The fact that individuality and your unique nature of your identity are erased and removed. Next quote, in no way am I going to profess to be an expert on female biology, and certainly not female biology in the area of reproduction, but this is interesting here in the next quote. The chanting goes on, it begins to catch me. I can feel slight pains in my belly, my breasts are heavy. Janine screams, I'm sweating now. The false pains clench at me. The others feel it too. I can tell by the way they sway. I believe that's referred to as a phantom pregnancy. Other non-pregnant women apparently can also produce milk, being in the company of pregnant women or women who've recently given birth. I'm happy to be corrected on that. I know very little about this. But that strange togetherness, that homogeneous link through birth and bodies, something which unites the women and the handmaids. It's not very often they show togetherness. It's up to you how you see it, but I think more often than not, Atwood shows a fragmented and divided group of people squabbling or rivalry, competition. But there are two things that stand out to me. The birthing sort of ceremonies, not the ceremony when the birth is made, the baby is made, when a birth is happening, like now, and of course, horribly, the particular. There is a sense of togetherness there, but always with that focus on individuality being erased. Okay, so I've highlighted the pronouns here in the next quote. We lean forward, our backs, bellies hair from the strain. It's coming like a bugle. There's maybe some sort of biblical allusion there to the day of judgment. There's a sense of threat or anxiety in terms of whether the baby is healthy or not. A call to arms like a wall. So I think this shows you the degree to which, yes, there's resistance, but even with all the similes, shows you how interpolated, posh term for brainwashing, with ideology, Offred is, and the fellow handmaids. Every sound she hears is likened to something biblical. This feeling of togetherness is likened to, somehow, impossibly, grown, mature women sharing the amniotic sort of sac in the womb, which is not physically, biologically possible. Okay, so shows you the degree to which she's been brainwashed, but an examiner would be more impressed by you using the word interpolated or conditioned, I guess. So there we have it. We feel like a heavy stone moving down. It's the baby. We think we will burst. We grip each other's hands. Definitely that idea of Aunt Lydia's knitted people. We are no longer single. Okay, moving on. Our eyes are on Janine in the dim light in her white gown. She glows like a moon in cloud. So we've highlighted earlier, and this is more of it. Get a store of these, depending on the question. More insubstantial, intangible imagery in relation to pregnant women. Certainly cloud features a lot, of course. Okay, we're with her. We're the same as her. The baby is fine. Oh, praise. Again, another sort of conditioned response. So, I don't know, in the time before, a great quote I use a lot when discussing The Handmaid's Tale. When a baby is born, the vast majority of people exclaim, oh, praise. No, but there's the extent of Gileadian new right conditioning, I guess. Very telling here. It's a girl, poor thing. So, born into the world of Gilead, her future is already mapped out for her. Poor thing. Atwood has said numerous times there's nothing in this book that didn't already exist, or hasn't already happened, or isn't already happening, I think is maybe one version of the quote. I'd have to double check on that. So, yeah, in parts of the world, even now in 2019, but certainly in the periods leading up to Atwood writing it, and depending on where you are in the world, your gender will determine your life path. Is that right? Is that correct? I have a feeling Atwood would say no. A little hint here at the sort of 60s and 70s and 80s. Remember when looking back at that period, the Gileadians call it a time of too much choice. To some extent that's proven and agreed with, I would argue, with the novel. Because there are birth defects, because there has been promiscuity, because there has been the sort of sexual revolution of the 60s and the pill and, drugs and alcohol and, excessive lifestyles of casual sex, the Gileadians seize on that to suggest that's why we are having infertility problems. That's why the species is struggling. So this little quote here, at least there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a little glance back at the contextual factors that are real, have been real historically. There were declining rates of fertility, arguably, in the 70s, particularly the 80s. But that's the thing the Gileadians have used to justify their takeover. A rare moment of victory here in this sort of postnatal incident in the narrative. So Aunt Elizabeth, there are smiles, they all smile, we are one smile, tears run down our cheek, getting an idea of fluids here in the female body, tears run down the cheek. Offred says her breasts are painful, they're leaking a little fake milk. It happens this way with some of us. So again, there's that strange homogeneous link and connection, but in this particular area it's through birth and bodies. Jubilant and victory, alright. Again, I've got a feeling these are very sort of Old Testament biblical words. So yes, it is a victory, it's a cause for celebration, but again it's sort of saturated in that Old Testament biblical language, which the Gileadians really, really endorse in their new right ideology. A little darker reminder here within amongst that as well before the mood turns gloomy. She'll be allowed to nurse the baby for a few months. They believe in mother's milk. They obviously wouldn't, actually. She'll never be sent to the colonies. She'll never be declared unwoman. That is her reward. Some reward. The baby she has made in their womb for 9 months is taken from her. So is that a reward? No consolation at all. Dystopian. Despite the fact that this is utopia to the Gileadians, they are saving the world along Christian lines. Look at the costs to Janine. She loses her baby, and the amazing glittering prize of you cannot be deemed an unwoman. Congratulations. Dearly me. Okay, just the gloomy sort of ending as the joy of this dies down. We ache. Each of us holds in her lap a phantom, a ghost baby. Ghost, clouds, all these kind of air within the red balloon. Just more of that imagery again. What confronts us, now the excitement's over, is our own failure. So the joy sort of dissipates, and then comes back the reminder that give me or give Gilead children, or else I die. Maybe not literally death, but, the pressure is there. The goal has to be realised for these fertile women. Okay, short little quote here. When we hear about Moira's attack and escape on Aunt Elizabeth, Moira, dressed up as Aunt Elizabeth, trying to escape, stood up straight and looked firmly ahead. She drew her shoulders back, pulled up her spine, and compressed her lips. This was not our usual posture. Usually we walked with heads bent down, our eyes on our hands or the ground. So you can see from there the role and identity of handmaids as this sort of cowed into sort of submission and to be submissive, sense of inferiority. Interesting that when Moira escapes posing as Aunt Elizabeth, the posture is entirely different, completely opposite. Two last quotes here. Moira was out there somewhere. She was at large or dead. Obviously we see her later. What would she do? The thought of what she would do expanded till it filled the room. So the handmaids now have an icon of rebellion at this point. It's not unproblematic though. It's not total enjoyment of the idea or the legend of Moira, as we'll see in a moment. First though, we've got Moira had power now. Power. She had been set loose. She had set herself loose. She was now a loose woman. Bit of pun, irony, humour there. You don't get much of that in The Handmaid's Tale. Interesting though, in terms of palimpsestic juxtaposition, that was once a sort of patriarchal label, might still be. I dread to think in this era of Trump, a loose, a promiscuous woman who has many sexual partners. But interestingly, this is now reappropriated, taken back by Offred through Atwood. Keep remembering to have that distinction, very important, to mean I have broken free of the Gilead regime. So takes that term, reappropriates it, reclaims it back, and is now using that in a sort of victory against her former oppressors. Look at this twist though. I think we found this frightening. So I've put over on the right here, to a large degree this shows the women are institutionalised, even as they gain a fantasy figure, quote there of fantasy, of power. They find that terrifying. So in a way they're still powerless in a sort of psychological capacity. You become acclimatised to your prison, you become institutionalised. If you've ever seen it or never seen it, watch the brilliant film The Shawshank Redemption to show you how the place that is your jail, your prison, your place of incarceration, whether you like it or not, becomes the norm, and the idea of leaving that is extremely terrifying if you've been there a long time. Another interesting simile here about the escaped Moira. Moira was like an elevator, okay, fine, solid thing, but look at this, with open sides. She made us dizzy. Already we were losing the taste for freedom. Already we were finding these walls secure. So there's your institutionalisation, okay? In the upper reaches of the atmosphere, wide open space, you'd come apart, you'd vaporise, there would be no pressure holding you together. So more insubstantial imagery here, not to do with the handmaids or identity, more to do with the abstract concept of freedom. It is not something desirable now. It has become terrifying to the handmaids. Moira was our fantasy. We hugged her to us. She was with us in secret. A giggle. She was lava beneath the crust of daily life. I like the idea of a giggle. Something that historically would have been associated only with the female gender, and probably, if you're being sort of Freudian and even further back, a sign of untristeria. So there's that rebelliousness in a particularly female form. In the light of Moira, the ants were less fearsome and more absurd. So you'll see a pattern here. They've lost some of their authority. Yes, they'll still be able to put X amount of volts through you with a cattle prod and whip your feet and do monstrous things, but they lose some of their authority. So I've put there, it's similar to when Offred visits the commander. The typical power structures begin to be partly We must never say completely. We must use adverbs of degree. Partly subverted in these parts of the narrative. She sees him as ridiculous, particularly when she whoops him at Scrabble, and he's a bit inarticulate. Okay. Their power had a flaw to it. So there's that idea we've mentioned earlier, dystopian regimes, totalitarian regimes. I mean, Trump probably is, theoretically, the most powerful man in the world. But, I don't know, can you look at him and not, well, I defy anyone not to snigger, laugh at the stupidity and ridiculousness of that giant bewigged what's it. Okay, there we go. They could be now shanghaied in toilets. The audacity was what we liked. So look over the space of this quote here. Hooray, Moira! Oh my God, freedom is terrifying. Hey, Moira. Okay, so Offred isn't inconsistent. I think it's just very typical of a mind that lives in a trapped regime, that she can't quite decide whether this escape is something to be savoured and banked and used and enjoyed, or something simultaneously to be terrified of as well at the same time. But nothing happened. Moira didn't reappear. She hasn't yet, but does do later. Okay, change of focus on these coming chapters now. We start to have a greater concern with history. And obviously I gave you the Orwell quote earlier about controlling history and shaping it. But Atwood's novel in these chapters now starts to be very much concerned with how history will perceive, regard, but also contort or adapt or misshape and sort of bend history. How you can never perfectly or fully capture a past event, as it is dependent on interpretation, point of view, perspective, what you leave out, what you put in. So this anxiety that Atwood has, I think, in terms of history's ability to capture and accurately relay information to future generations. The key word in all of this, as you can see here, is reconstruction. Any telling of past events is a reconstruction. Very important to emphasise that prefix there. It is remade. As we said, there are flaws, things will be left out, things will be omitted, etc, etc. Now this is a useful chapter to use in relation to the historical notes section of the book, which sort of ends as a sort of epilogue. So depending on your question, whether you're made to or choose to write about the historical notes chapter, chapter 23 is a great one to put with it because of this. So here's where Offred is conscious of being picked up and heard by a later generation. So she says, but if you happen to be a man sometime in the future and you've made it this far, please remember, you will never be subjected to the temptation of feeling you must forgive a man as a woman. Okay, so what we're getting at here is this kind of hugely unequal sort of societal judgment of the genders. So I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase boys will be boys. That is basically just a license for the male gender to do whatever daft or destructive nonsense they can justify or choose to do. And yet the conditioning of women to go, oh God, what you like? Don't worry, we'll just buy a new car. You drove the last one into a wall, as boys will be boys. So this definitely links to the historical notes chapter. If you look on the side here, Offred's story and her voice, her entire identity is determined and altered by PX02's take and reconstruction of it. Feminists often refer to history as his-story. Okay, so that's not a typing mistake there. They see history itself as a sort of narrative which tends to justify male behaviour, male abuse of power. So that's something they're very, very alive to. Perhaps this will be finally altered when Atwood eventually, in the coming months, releases the sequel to The Handmaid's Tale. So the narrative will not end on PX02's retrospective reconstruction of Offred's life. So we said these chapters are concerned with history. Very shortly in chapter 24, we can see how history can even revise, alter, skew, and adapt the identity of Hitler and his wife, Eva Braun. Crazy, terrifying stuff, but we shall see this in a moment. Just the ending of that section there perhaps is Margaret Atwood's antidote to all of this. Stop thinking of the world in terms of power and control, but she asserts the importance of forgiveness. Maybe it isn't about, maybe none of it, maybe it isn't all these negators and negatives. Just to come to these last two sentences, maybe it's about who can do what to whom and be forgiven for it. Quite a Christian ethos, really. Surprisingly, perhaps, of let he or she who is without sin cast the first stone. Never tell me it amounts to the same thing. So, I don't know how religious Margaret Atwood is. I have no idea. Maybe that's something you could look up. But in a novel where the dystopian future is shaped by a new right Christian ideology, maybe she's suggesting that, this whole forgiveness thing, that is also in the book you're basing your world model or world view on. Perhaps you should be giving a little bit more attention to the idea of forgiveness. You seem to have forgotten that part of your biblical sort of teaching. Focus shifts back towards birth here for a moment or two. Cora and Offred. So it's up to me to repay the team, justify my food and keep. A very sort of new right, conservative or republican point of view. Everyone has a role in society. If you're a sociology student, I believe you still study a group called the functionalists, who are very sort of representative of new right ideology. Society is made up of cogs. They all have to integrate and weave together for the machine of society to work and function correctly. An interesting sort of worldview, and helpful, I think, towards the Gilead regime. But look here, in terms of women and female aspirations reduced to reproductive roles, Cora here definitely shows the success of Gileadian new right ideology, and completely interpolated by it. So bless her, Cora, she says, maybe we have one soon. She hopes, and I am the vehicle for her hope. Her hope is of the simplest kind. She wants a birthday here with guests and food and presents. She wants a little child to spoil in the kitchen, to iron clothes for, to slip cookies into when no one's watching. I am to provide these joys for her. So, simple or simplest, to use the adjective that Atwood has Offred use. This will have been, I don't want to patronise here, but this will have been the height of ambition, or the main ambition for so many women, for so many generations and decades. So there's nothing wrong with Cora's view here, quite the opposite. But maybe Atwood is wanting us to interrogate that, should this be the height of ambition for women? Equally, should it be correct to hope for more, extra, different? It's the whole sort of feminist debate of, is it empowering to be mother, protector and carer? Or should we also want careers as well as that, in addition to, in replacement of? A whole other discussion to be had, but not for this. Okay, the illicit meeting with the commander. This first quote here, I've put 1, 2, 4 and 5 in the box. I actually think you can build in 3 as well, but we'll talk about that in a second. So, we are two-legged wombs, that's all. Sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices. So, on the right there you can see biblical language, ideology to control and define women, sort of classic dystopian tropes of controlling and prescribing identity, what you are, what you cannot be, or think of yourself in terms of. You've got this sort of absurd imagery, something like a Monty Python animation, a two-legged womb, but although that's quite comedic and maybe absurd, there's a very serious point to it, in the sense that new right ideology has succeeded in this fictitious world that Atwood has created, in that biological reductionism. that's the sole purpose of women in this utopia for the Gilead regime, but forthcoming dystopia if new right ideology is left unchecked. The reason why I thought we can also bring in number 3 as well is the sort of irony in this statement. It is forbidden for us to be alone with the commanders. We are for breeding purposes. We aren't concubines, geisha girls, courtesans. Well, in a way, this particular encounter pushes Offred more towards that particular role, really. So there's a certain amount of irony in the hypocrisy of this illicit meeting contradicting those Gilead ideals and ideologies that actually Offred is, at this minute or in these kind of encounters, closer to a concubine, a geisha girl or a courtesan. We see that much later in Jezebel's, of course, but there's another of those hypocrisies of new right ideology here. So your memories of past figures or roles for women in the sex trade, concubines, geisha girls, courtesans, this is actually proving to be true once again. Also, if you're thinking of memories and palimpsestic juxtaposition, the word forbidden takes us back to a certain biblical event in the book of Genesis, of course. So there's at least 2 hypocrisies you could tease out of that in terms of new right Christian ideology. Interesting second quote here in terms of power, and as I've put in the box on the right hand side, the subversion or the inversion of power structures. Again, it's not massive in a way it probably can't be. It's a dystopian novel, but there is something there that troubles power structures and hierarchies in this moment, as Offred says. But there must be something he wants from me. To want is to have a weakness. And then that leads to curiosity, which is a very dangerous thing within a dystopian novel and a totalitarian regime. I want to know what he wants. Very dangerous to ask questions. I guess it's okay to wonder about those answers privately, inwardly, but they are not the kind of things you express outwardly. Dystopian regimes quickly eradicate such curiosity. You've also got a good quote here that links forward to a quote from Aunt Lydia later on. Again, it's something very hypocritical. We'll come to that quote later, but it's where Aunt Lydia talks about a female power to seduce and sort of win over men using their feminine wiles. Offred is very quick and very right to point out, well, there's nowhere in the Bible that recommends or endorses that, but we'll come to that further hypocrisy later on. Another example of an interesting palimpsestic juxtaposition here. As she enters the room, she notices that the way he stands, it's a studied pose, something of the country squire from the time before, the old come-on from a glossy men's mag from the time before. He probably decided ahead of time that he'd be standing like that when I came in. When I knocked, he probably rushed over to the fireplace and propped himself up. So, interesting sort of juxtaposition here between the dating etiquette and, you know, the old sort of courtship, to use a really old-fashioned term, between a man and a woman. But the irony of this juxtaposition is it is not the same as the time before. So these customs and this kind of dating etiquette is deliberately out of place. It jars, it clashes between the context of now, where he is in total control in this dystopian theocracy, compared to the time before of free will and, you know, dating and, compliance and agreeing to be the partner of someone. Another of these recurring similes or comparisons here in terms of Offred's identity and what her identity has been reduced to within this Gileadian context. You must find this strange, and as she quite rightly says, that's the understatement of the year. Used, I feel like cotton candy, sugar and air. Squeeze me and I turn into a small, sickly, damp wad of weeping pinky red. Okay, so there's that colour again, weeping pinky red, definitely to do with insubstantial imagery again. I've put here on the right, though, it's not so much to do with biological determinism now. But this feeling of being insubstantial and nothing and sort of fluff and cotton candy, which is literally sugar and air, of course, is caused by how out of place the greeting hello sounds. So this phatic speech seems like something from a distant age. A dinosaur might well wander through the room. It's that anachronistic. It doesn't belong and sounds jarringly out of place in this context. So this contributes to Offred yet again, but for different reasons this time, feeling insubstantial, not whole or solid. Next quote, I've just added in number 3 there as well, so this quote can be made to speak to 1, 5, 3 and 4, I guess. They're playing Scrabble, as you do when you are alone in an illicit relationship within a dystopian regime. You crack open the Scrabble, naturally. We notice here, though, now, of course, it's something different. Now it's forbidden for us. Now it is dangerous. Now it's indecent. Making words on a board with some tiles. Now it's something he can't do with his wife. Now it's desirable. So the reason why I've added 3 in there as well is, I guess it's that phrase, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So we're in a brave new world, to borrow from Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel, which is taken from The Tempest, of course. Men now and then still enticed by the forbidden, acts outside of marriage and fidelity. So men not coming off too well here. I'll leave you to debate that, whether that is historically accurate or true or not true. But yes, even within Gilead now, men are still not content with the wife they have. They need something extra or more, or the thrill of the illicit. I love this comparison. It's as if he's offered me drugs, okay? It takes someone as clever as Margaret Atwood and the way she creates a dystopian world to liken a game of Scrabble to taking illicit substances. Very interesting and complex moment here as well from this chapter 23. I've also just added number 2 in as well, because I think these quotes speak to number 2 in terms of dystopian tropes. Largely, my instruction there is to read the blue stuff first, okay? So, in fact, I don't think about anything of the kind. I put it in only afterwards. Maybe I should have thought about that at the time, but I didn't. As I said, this is a reconstruction. So, start with that, because Offred's been sort of playing tricks with you, the reader, in this moment. So let's look at some of the yellow stuff here as to why I've added in dystopian things as well. Green things, beg your pardon. So if we look at this bit, I think about how I could take the back of the toilet apart, the toilet in my own bathroom. I could get the sharp lever out and hide it in my sleeve. This has all been made possible from the tale of Moira, of course. So remember we said they now have a rebellious icon, a role model, some kind of precedent for rebelling and possibly escaping too. And then she offered, retrospectively, she didn't at the time, don't forget that, fantasises about driving the sharp end into him suddenly between his ribs. I think about the blood coming out of him, hot as soup, sexual over my hands. Dearie me, that's an extremely disturbing moment. We see another instance of that, of course, in the Partisecution. Now, we're not saying Offred has become, always has been, a cold-hearted killer. That's not what we're saying at all. But the reason why I've put dystopian tropes in there, this is what she has become. So, again, I've never been in sort of a dystopian regime, thankfully, or imprisoned. But I think it's natural when you read enough of it that you see thoughts of murder and rebellion, a natural urge of those imprisoned. I guess imprisoned full stop. Again, I've got no first-hand experience of this, thankfully, but certainly in a dystopian regime, if you take away someone's liberty and freedom, no matter how you dress it up in religious ideology or try and spin it as we're saving the world one child at a time, you resent your captors. And you inherently, whether you're aware of it, subconsciously, consciously, maybe it lies dormant, you have resentment, which can easily, as we're seeing here, spill over into murderous fantasies. In terms of palimpsestic juxtaposition, real mouthful to say, but very impressive to write in essays. I love how this paragraph is structured. So we have lots of sort of flashbacks from the past, again, old dating etiquette. I keep using the word jar or jarring, and that's what juxtaposition is about. You put clashing things next to each other, or in the case of a palimpsest, on top of each other. So one of these being go home. Yes, I would love to, but you're keeping me here as prisoner in Gilead in this theocracy. But obviously then she clarifies my room. But the distance between that noun, the signifier, and the signified, what it means, is clashing here and very, very uncomfortable, I guess, for Offred. This is not home, so let's not use the label as though it is some kind of home. He asks me if I will be all right. Well, everything's under armed guard and under surveillance all the time, so as if the stairway is a dark street. That maybe sends us back to the propaganda video that Aunt Lydia was using earlier, which contained footage of Offred's mother in a feminist campaign, Take Back the Night. So again, these clever little hints towards the past, which is actually the present of Atwood's readers in 1980s and now. So evenings are not safe for women to walk around. Wrongly so, of course, but again, another clashing, ironic juxtaposition between then and now. This is like being on a date. This is like sneaking into the dorm after hours. This is conspiracy. So again, you're looking at sort of teenage encounters at university or college or films of that time. It's evoking that, but clearly it is not the same as that by any way, shape or form. Palimpsestic juxtaposition. This course obviously ends on a note of power as well. She consents to the kiss, I guess, but that's not enough for him. Not like that, he says, as if you meant it. He was so sad. That is a reconstruction too. So again, she's sort of retrospectively remembering that, and maybe she didn't reflect on that at the time. As if you meant it, dearie me. We're getting towards this very postmodern idea of something that has to be fake in order for it to feel real. So, okay, I'm not asking, I don't think Atwood is asking for a ton of sympathy towards the commander here, but in some small particular way, you can start seeing the commander as a fellow prisoner of the Gilead regime as well. Nowhere near on the level of Offred and everyone else. That's not what I'm saying. But Atwood does have these kind of flickers momentarily where Aunt Lydia, Serena Joy, the commander also feel the constraints of this supposed utopia, but obviously Margaret Atwood's dystopia. Moving into chapter 24, we're seeing this moment I hinted at earlier from Aunt Lydia, some more of her propaganda. But something has changed now, tonight. Circumstances have altered. I can ask for something. So power shifts in these chapters. Obviously, Offred gains a degree. Please qualify that in terms of quantities. Don't make her the new Serena Joy or Aunt Lydia. She's by no means on that level of power in the hierarchy. But still remains, I can ask for something. Possibly not much, but something. In this next quote, we're getting another narrative trick here from Offred. So be careful of this, because apparently the way it's written here is that Aunt Lydia said, men are sex machines, said Aunt Lydia, and not much more. They only want one thing, you must learn to manipulate them for your own good. Offred then goes on to say that Aunt Lydia did not actually say this, but it was implicit in everything she did say. So again, a little bit of a trick here from Offred and her narration. She didn't exactly or explicitly say it, but it was implicit in everything she did say. This sentiment, hovered over her head like the golden mottos over the saints. aspects of the darker ages. Interesting here. So on the right, we've got a mockery here of Lydia's skewed version of Christian ideology. No mention of God telling women to manipulate men. Okay, so there's the hypocrisies as one of many flaws in what's being passed off as Christianity. Again, you can sort of take bits of the Bible, and horrible extremist groups do adapt and manipulate that to push their own narrow-minded or bigoted agenda. The Westboro Baptist Church is something you may be familiar with. It's not comfortable viewing at all, but people like this do exist in the world in the 21st century, unbelievably. But there we go. I just want to focus here on the characterisation of Aunt Lydia. So Offred says, like them too, the saint of the darker ages, she, Aunt Lydia, was angular and without flesh. Now, it's worth noticing the physical description of Aunt Lydia and, to a lesser extent, Serena Joy throughout the novel, particularly as you get towards the later or end chapters. She's sort of arthritic, she's leaning on a cane, she's sort of shaking and struggling to move physically. There's something sort of palsied and decaying and deteriorating about Aunt Lydia. Here, with the sort of without flesh, she's sort of getting skeletal and deathly. So this isn't an accident, okay? We don't want to sort of get into the health and lifestyle and age of the character who is not real. So we're clearly getting towards Aunt Lydia and their physical description and their movement as being symbolic of New Right ideology, something palsied, decaying, rotten, death-like and skeletal. Depending on how strong you want to see it, you could see it as outward suggesting that this ideology, this belief system, this way of thinking and shaping the world needs to die away and die off. If you look here as well, you can link that with darker ages, so hinting at sort of medieval sort of church authority here, unquestioned authority. So not just the dark ages, the darker ages. This is a satirical sort of critique of New Right ideology. Keep an eye out as well for this sort of without flesh, emaciated, pale, deathly, dying out description. We have the historical figure of Ava Brown coming up in a moment, and this large section here referring to the concentration camps. So I think what you can do is you're being invited to draw parallels between proponents, people who propose or embody or practice and preach this kind of extremist far-right ideology, being portrayed or linked with sort of deathly imagery in relation to themselves, and or causing tremendous suffering and death, because we're about to move into the very, very disturbing territory of the Holocaust now in this next section of it. Okay, so we move into this section now. I think structurally we have this idea of without flesh and this focus on surveillance here, classic sort of dystopian stuff, and then structurally the chapter moves into this large digression about a memory from a historical documentary Offred can recall watching with her mother. So keep an eye on that structuring, the sort of emaciated, without flesh nature of Aunt Lydia, and then these parallels with the Nazis here. In terms of the wider narrative of the Handmaid's Tale, Offred's narrative, Offred's story, this chapter is very, very important for the historical notes section, the chapter which sort of tails or ends the Handmaid's Tale, because this section here shows how history can shape, reshape, revise, adapt, put a spin on, to use a less academic sort of way of phrasing it, historical figures, even figures such as Hitler and Eva Braun, in a way which makes them seem, if we're not careful, less monstrous. So Atwood, as much science fiction dystopian literature does, issues an extremely strong cautionary tale or warning here. More specifically here is about the damage that can be done to real life historical atrocities when they're sort of translated, if you like, or given a sort of narrative explanation. The other part of the warning here comes on the next slide when we see the quote, really important quote in terms of these ideas. Quote, "The times were abnormal." Okay, so you can look back on things that have been done historically, and it's sort of the way of justifying it to oneself. Oh, it was the times, man. It was the 70s. It was the 80s. Oh, we all did that back then. We're maybe a little bit ashamed of it now, but well, that's what you did in the 19, etc., etc. Okay, Atwood, I think, is doing two things with her. She's saying how easy it is to justify moments of atrocity in a way that sort of lets you escape blame, and to blame the times, not the actions or the inactions, depending what you didn't do, of people involved at the time. The other thing she's doing with this, of course, is to highlight this sort of passing the blame and blaming it on the times, in the sense that, to her 1980s audience, it's that phrase, if good people do nothing, that's all it takes for evil to reign, or something like that. That tends to be attributed to American presidents, that phrase, but it was actually by John Stuart Mill, so be careful of that. So yeah, there's Atwood warning that, well, if we let this tide sort of swell and increase of new right ideology, then we can very easily and quickly find ourselves in the return of fascism and genocide on a scale mankind has never witnessed before. It's the same feeling now. As I'm recording this, Boris Johnson has just become Prime Minister of England. Donald Trump is firmly ensconced in the White House. It's the similar feeling most people, a lot of people, not everyone, are starting to get now, in terms of this tide of sort of fascism and right-wing, extreme right-wing ideology starting to mount and surface. Okay, so enough about our surrounding ideas. Let's look at the quotations here, which reinforce those surrounding ideas. So Offred recalls that it was the sort of thing my mother liked to watch, historical educational. She tried to explain it to me afterwards, to tell me that the things in it, the Holocaust, concentration camps, had really happened. But to me it was only a story. There are in the world, I remember seeing this on late night news maybe about 5, 6, 7 years ago, people who are called Holocaust deniers, which is just absolutely incredible to my mind and unbelievable, but people are determined to prove that the Nazis did not slaughter the Jews on a scale that is just incredible to think about, which is incredible that you would deny that, but there we go. But Offred's mother is really, really keen to point out that this is actual lived history. The danger being, once it becomes something of historical study, the word story is in history, these lived atrocities can be a little bit diluted and lose their impact perhaps. So the importance of remembering this was actually happening and that humanity allowed this to happen. Now, the distinction here is that Offred is a child, and she says, to me, then, if you like, it was only a story. I thought someone had made it up. I suppose all children think that about any history before their own. Here's the key line here. If it's only a story, it becomes less frightening. So very important that Offred's mum is there asserting the fact that this is real and not a fabrication or a narrative. This obviously speaks to Offred's narrative as well, of course, which is glossed and sort of finished and bookended by Professor P.X. Oter. So I think there's a concern here from Atwood through Offred that this story, Offred's fictitious story, needs to be treated with a sense of reality. Otherwise, if we dismiss it, we are going to see the rise of the new right again, and we'll end up in that situation. Remember, lots of good science fiction dystopian writing is prescient. It has that eerie ability to predict the future based on how we are at the present and where we are likely to end up if we are not watchful and protective and guarding our civil liberties. You can use a quote from Shakespeare if you wish, which is a bit sort of adapted from The Tempest. What's past is prologue. That's used differently in the play, but that saying has come to mean whatever we've witnessed in the past, it's likely to be a good indicator of what's about to come. So ideas of sort of cyclical history, really. These things come around, and some awful things come around if we're not mindful and guarding against the rise of such bigotry and damaging ideologies. To reinforce this idea of things that are supposedly stories are actually lived atrocities, look at the imagery here to do with colours. They showed clips from films of the time, black and white, and still photos. Okay, yes, technology at that time, colour photography was not in the mainstream. That's not what we're getting at here. I think the idea goes towards showing, oh, it's dusty. You can see a mixture of sunlight and dust and coated. So is that really real? Does that touch us in the same way? If it was something that happened, quote unquote, a long time ago? That's the danger Margaret Atwood is pointing out here. Even though things are black and white and in still photography, one particular image captured and coated and covered in dust, we need to be very, very aware, if we're not careful and mindful, that these things, well, look, there's the transition you can see, can't you? The interviews with people still alive then, now on television, were in colour. So look at that transition, that juxtaposition from black and white to colour. This has been, and can become again, lived lives, if we're not careful. The use of the child perspective here in terms of history and story is very effective here. So if you look here, the interviews with people still alive, then were in colour. The one I remember best was with a woman, Ava Brown, we're about to find out, although she's not named, who had been the mistress of a man who had supervised one of the camps where they put the Jews before they killed them. So, in ovens, my mother said, but there weren't any pictures of the ovens. Now, that's being used to raise the idea, well, if there wasn't a photograph of them, did they exist? Is this all a fabrication? These are the dangers that lived atrocities are subject to. And again, it's the same sort of anxiety about Offred's narrative, which is obviously not real in the way that the Holocaust is grotesquely real, but it's that vigilance again of being aware of the mistakes of history and how they can recur. So I got the confused notion that these deaths are taking place in kitchens. There is something especially terrifying to a child in that idea. Ovens mean cooking, and cooking comes before eating. I thought these people had been eaten. So it's not mentioned, but I think you can see that as alluding to some kind of fairy tale. I remember sort of Hansel and Gretel straying into the cottage of the old woman, and the threat that she would throw them in the hot oven and eat them because she ate little children. So that deliberate, if it is deliberate, allusion to sort of a fairy tale is again used to kind of raise that concern of, don't just dismiss this as fiction, as myth, as folklore or fairy tale. Sometimes the things that can be seen as impossible and almost beyond the realms of reality have actually, in our grotesque history at times, actually happened. Moving further into the quote here, this is the bit that really still gives me the shivers and the chills each time I read it. It doesn't matter how many times I read it. There was a black and white, there it is again, shot of hair and another woman in the two-piece bathing suits and platform shoes and picture hats of the time. They were wearing cat's eye sunglasses and sitting in deck chairs by a swimming pool. Okay, all fine and dandy. The swimming pool was beside their house. all fine and dandy. That's where most people who have a swimming pool have their house. But it's this next phrase here, which was near the camp with the ovens. Okay, so that's that chilling juxtaposition. All right, while they're away living their very affluent and leisurely lifestyles in the height of modern fashion and enjoying fashions and enjoying their lives, a stone's throw away, I guess comparatively, is the slaughter of, as much of the Jews as the Nazis could possibly aim at. Really extremely chilling stuff. So it moves over onto the next slide here, but before we just kind of flick across to that, I just want to notice this stuff in the box here, because we're moving towards this now. So through juxtaposition, Atwood is challenging how identity can be, I guess, very easily manipulated by history and historians. I gave you the Orwell quote about controlling the past and controlling the future again. This idea very much comes to the fore now. So we get here as we move on. The woman said she didn't notice much that she found unusual. She denied knowing about the ovens. At the time of the interview, 40 or 50 years later, she was dying of emphysema. That tends to be something that's caused by smoking. She coughed a lot. She was very thin, almost emaciated, but she still took pride in her appearance. So I want you to notice that pattern, please. The description of Elia with Aunt Lydia and Angela without flesh. Some of the stills of that time showing the darkness under eyes and cheekbones. And then we get this depiction of Eva Brown here, dying of emphysema, thin, emaciated, etc., etc. So the common thing which floats across this is that sort of deathly imagery. Yes, that makes sense in terms of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. They were starved, treated appallingly, and then killed. But these people who voice or articulate and believe in this new right ideology, this extremism, let's call it for what it is, this fascism, this fascist extremism, are depicted in this sort of skeletal way. So if you're in any doubt of how destructive Atwood is portraying this, rightly so, of course, obviously, then it's there in the symbolic description of these characters, one fictitious, one historical, of people who believe in this new right ideology. In terms of historical revisionism and the idea that history can easily be manipulated to, I'm not going to say paint Hitler and the Nazis as saints and angels, although that would have been done by the Nazis, kind of, saying they're doing God's work by exterminating Jewish people. Dear me. We see this in blue here. So he was not a monster, she said. People say he was a monster, but he was not one. Alright then, this should be good. Let's hear what you've got to explain or justify why Hitler was not a monster. The times were abnormal. There's that great quote I've mentioned earlier. She did not believe he was a monster. Well, some people believe that, the moon is made of cream cheese. That's okay then. Therefore, the moon is undeniably made of cream cheese if one person believes that. So here are the dangers here of subjective interpretations and how, in the wrong hands, history can be manipulated and skewed by the powerful elite. He was not a monster, to her. Oh, well, that's okay. So ridiculous sort of stuff here, look. Probably, look at that speculative adverb, he had some endearing trait. Oh, he whistled off key in the shower. He had a yen for truffles. He called his dog Liebchen, and he made it sit up for little pieces of raw steak. Have a little look at some of the AO3 stuff down the bottom here. I've added in for you. How easy it is to invent a humanity for anyone at all. It's quite tricky here to see who's speaking, alright? You get a lot of blurring of whose thoughts and ideas this is, deliberately so. That's called free indirect thought. So it's tricky to know who's speculating with this probably he had some endearing trait. He whistled off key. that's likely to be reporting of what Eva Brown says in the documentary, but it's very, very difficult to know. So that's deliberate, I would suggest. The blurring of who is speaking is used to show how quickly and how easily these views can sort of adhere and stick and become, the dominant historical narrative. Oh, Hitler, he wasn't that bad. God, he used to whistle now. He had a lovely pet name for his dog. So that blurring of who is speaking shows you how dangerous and how easily these ideas can become mainstream or accepted. Again, wondering who's speaking. A big child, she would have said to herself. So again, it all has to come back to Offred, I guess, because it's only a first-person narrative. All of these views are afforded to us through Offred. She's the filter and sort of the medium. So is Offred sort of imagining herself into the mind of Eva Brown? A big child, she would have said to herself. Her heart would have melted. She would have smoothed the hair back from his forehead, kissed him on the ear, and not just to get something out of him either. Look at these maternal instincts and loving instincts that Offred is imagining in this Brown-Hitler relationship. The instinct to soothe, to make it better. There, she'd say, as he woke from a nightmare. So this is a sort of projection. Do we know if Hitler had nightmares? I don't want to know. It's very uncomfortable to think about that. But Atwood is making us think about that through Offred's narration. Things are so hard for you. All this she would have believed, because otherwise, how could she have kept on living? So through Atwood, Offred is... Sorry, other way around. Through Offred, Atwood is hoping that it's some shred or scrap of humanity and guilt and conscience, even within figures like Eva Brown and Adolf Hitler. She was very ordinary under that beauty. There's an unbelievable line. She believed in decency. She was nice to the Jewish maid, one Jewish person. Or nice enough. Nicer than she needed to be. Oh, there you go. All crimes absolved. There you go. History can just forget about the Holocaust. She was nice to the Jewish maid once, or nicer than she needed to be. The modern equivalent, I guess, is when people come out with, some of my best friends are, and then they go on to say something disgustingly racist, homophobic, or intolerant or bigoted. Okay, so the other key thing that floats through here is, of course, the idea of makeup. So we have this green thing here. She was carefully made up. Heavy mascara, rouge on the bones. There's that deathly imagery floating around. Proponents of New Right ideology again. Of her cheeks. Bones and cheeks remind you of what these people have been guilty of and part of. Over which the skin was stretched like a rubber glove, pulled tight. And then the final word on this particular section, with its concerns about history and how past events can be doctored and manipulated, makeup. Alright, so here on the left, Offred has Atwood's, wrong way around again, sorry. Atwood has Offred's lasting thought or memory of the documentary, makeup. A veneer of appearance and civility, a critique of all those whose subjective idea of decency is genocide. Now that's a truly monstrous sort of clash, isn't it? I believe in decency, me. Oh yeah, what did you do last week? Well, and then concentration camps and slaughter and the Holocaust. Unbelievable that events like that can be passed off and manipulated as serving the greater good of humanity. Unbelievable. So to sum this very kind of powerful, extremely sort of serious subject matter here, it almost seems ridiculous to call it serious subject matter. This is heavy stuff indeed. Look on the right here. Atwood, I think, is wanting to raise awareness of how historical revisionism, the ability to revise and adapt history, and the self-deceit that monsters tell themselves. So link that into these fictitious but possibly real, if the world doesn't keep in check the new right hierarchies in the 1980s, when Atwood is writing this novel, can become real again, results in dystopian monstrousness. So there's the Gileadians telling themselves they are doing God's work here. It's a warning, isn't it? Clearly it is a warning. And again, it's absolutely relevant now to the times, with Messrs Johnson and Trump in charge of two very powerful countries. Look here as well at the convenient justification of the times were abnormal to justify and excuse genocide and mass murder. Okay, really, really heavy stuff, not easy to talk about and listen to. I need a break from it now. So I've added some notes under here as well, which I've pilfered from somewhere. So that shows you more allusions to the Nazis and the atrocities they committed from some of the notes here as well. Okay, so that was lots of heavy stuff, but I just want to quickly show the sort of flow of this chapter in terms of AO2 and structuring of this chapter. So recently, in terms of like Offred's life and narrative and events, I guess, we've had I'm the commander, meet me for naughty Scrabble, kiss me like you mean it. A flashback to how Offred remembers a documentary from her childhood trying to gloss and manipulate the portrayal of the Nazis. Drawing parallels between the new right of Gilead and historical atrocities of the past, leading up to this moment. So all of that is a lot to take in for Offred, and so it all builds to this moment here of this imagery of unburdening, release and escape. So there are many different forms of cost and toll this dystopian regime takes upon Offred's mind and body. But here you can see, on the right-hand side, if you look through her body, Atwood shows how Offred almost bursts with hysteria and laughter at her absurd and awful predicament. So the hypocrisies at the heart of Gilead, the parallels between Nazi Germany and the Gilead regime, and so her body just sort of explodes here, metaphorically of course. So her reaction to this is almost an out-of-body experience, sort of a split or a fragmented relationship between mind and body. So if you look at it here, she's almost describing the actions or reactions to all of this stuff we've mentioned in almost in third-person terms. Look, noise is coming out of the broken place in my face without warning. I wasn't thinking about here or there or anything. If I let the noise get out into the air, it will be laughter, too loud, too much of it. And then you're back into sort of classic dystopian territory, aren't you? With surveillance and control and imprisonment and punishment. So someone is bound to hear. And then there will be hurrying footsteps and commands, and who knows. We then sort of get towards, I guess, number 3, really, in terms of memories, history, and 5, memories of the mistreatment of women within a patriarchal society over time. So judgment, emotion inappropriate to the occasion, the wandering womb they used to think, hysteria, and then a needle, a pill, it could be fatal. And so she has to repress this. So a sort of time-honoured, not pleasant of course, not wanted, but let's not kid ourselves, a historical sort of repression of women, their thoughts, their feelings, their true, genuine reactions and emotions. I cramble with my hands over my mouth as if I'm about to be sick, drop to my knees, a position of sort of subjugation, the laughter boiling like lava in my throat. I crawl into the cupboard, draw up my knees, I'll choke on it, holding back, I stifle, I clench, tears are squeezing, here I am locked away in the closet, nolite te bastardes carborandorum, don't let the bastards grind you down. So interesting, her body sort of has to react to all of this stuff she's just regurgitated or experienced, but it has to take the form, a historical form of female repression. In terms of power, again, I think we can see these very small but very real shifts of power here. We must kind of add a bit of subtlety with that in terms of quantity. It's not an overthrowing of the Gilead regime just from having a laugh and a giggle in a cupboard, but they have to be on this small scale because we're in a dystopian, totalitarian regime, you see. So we've got here, there's no way out of here. So hysterical as she realises yet again her imprisonment. I lie on the floor, breathing too fast, then slower, evening out my breathing, as in the exercises for giving birth. So, if you look on the right here, Offred is using the tools of her Gileadian conditioning to regain control of her body, self, state of mind, to escape trouble. Again, it's not revolutionary, it's not overthrowing the regime, but that does represent a small but powerful, all that's available to Offred, victory over the regime here. All I can hear now is the sound of my own heart, opening and closing, opening and closing, opening. It's up to you whether you see that as some kind of very, very quiet and subtle hint towards what appears to be her escape in the final chapter. Given that she's just said there's no way out of here. Okay, so on to Soul Scrolls, something less genocidal and slightly less, oh my god. Okay, so here we've got some important details here that are satirically critiquing New Right ideology and I guess the mission of Gilead to repopulate the planet along Christian and wholesome lines. There's a couple of quotes here that start to undermine that really and show, as it says there on the right, more, because there have been some previously and will be some later again, more imagery of failed attempts at life and fertility. Now you can read that two ways. One is, of course, as I've just mentioned, the sort of mockery and satirical critique of Gilead. However, I think there are moments when the time before is being mentioned, the 60s, 70s and 80s. Atwood is maybe asking her readership to think about some of the repercussions of the lifestyles people have been leaving. So again, sort of drink, drugs, casual sex, how we treat or mistreat the environment, an impact on our bodies and fertility in the species going forward. So there are times in The Handmaid's Tale when I think Atwood has that sort of dual critique or dual criticism. I'm not saying it's even. I think it is much more critical of the Gilead regime than it is the way we live. But in a genre that's about striking cautionary tales or asking us to think and consider our behaviour, otherwise we'll end up in X, Y and Z, there is that sort of focus as well at times. So on these notes, there's a mention there of breakfast and a dropped egg, but obviously an egg as a symbol of fertility. We can see that as being a reference to maybe abortion. Flushed the handful of egg which could not be salvaged down the toilet. Then we get this moment here with Serena Joy, who, like Aunt Lydia, is the other character who symbolises or represents symbolically this new right ideology of Gilead. Let's have a look at some of the detail here. The tulips have had their moment and are done, shedding their petals one by one, like teeth. So the petals have been shed like teeth that I guess have fallen out. One day I came upon Serena Joy kneeling on a cushion in the garden, her cane beside her on the grass. She was snipping off the seed pods with a pair of shears. Now, it's impossible not to look at that in terms of fertility and life. I'm not an expert on gardening. We get some help here when Offred says to cut off the seed pods is supposed to make the bulbs store energy. So that may or may not be true. Again, I'm not a gardening expert. However, we're definitely looking at this idea of killing fertility here. So is this an hypocrisy in the sense that Gilead are pro-life and, you know, they anti-abortion and they see all life as sacred? Yet here they are, killing life. Is this imagery a little bit more wider ranging in terms of what Margaret Atwood is saying, is New Right ideology, despite its emphasis on anti-abortion, is that the biggest threat to sort of life and sort of killing life in terms of its repressive, hypocritical Christian ethos, or any other permutations of that. But it's very important symbolism to note, I think, in a novel so concerned with birth and fertility. As with that Antilydia description earlier, we see something similar at work here with the characterisation of Serena Joy. Look at the stuff here in green, her cane. So she relies on that for support and to get up, I guess. Was it the arthritis creeping up? So symbolically, maybe look at that in terms of this sort of decay, this palsied character, sort of paralysis, old age, decay and death. There is certainly nothing to do with youth and vitality on display here, is it? So that's representative of her thinking, I guess, the ideology she represents, physically sort of satirically mocked in the characterisation of her. We've just seen previously lots of uncomfortable parallels between the Gilead regime and the Nazis in concentration camps. And then spookily, not so spookily, we have a German word inserted in the middle of this when the reader gets the symbolism of Serena Joy killing flowers, or some blitzkrieg. So blitzkrieg, a German word which means lightning war, a kind of very quick and sudden kill or eradication of someone or something, is inserted in here. If you just back up a little bit, still going with this idea of Gilead and parallels with the Nazis, you see Offred saying she, Serena Joy, was aiming, positioning the blades of the shears, then cutting with a convulsive jerk of the hands. So if you look at these sort of verbs that have a sort of purpose and intent behind them, aiming, positioning the blades, then cutting, and then you go for this idea of blitzkrieg, and then you link that to the parallels with the Nazis. This garden takes on a sort of metaphorical or allegorical significance, I think, in the same way the Nazis deemed the Jews unworthy of life, and civilization and the world would be improved with their removal. It's the same with the Gileadians. Every now and again in certain chapters you hear reference, which is usually the form of gossip, that this sect of Christianity have been wiped out or defeated by the Gileadians. This other faith, sometimes non-Christian faiths, have been successfully defeated. We don't know if that's true. It could all just be propaganda. And remember, we're limited and bound by first-person narration. But coming back to this moment here, these flowers, these tulips, sort of symbolically representative of nonconformists, other kinds of faiths, other kinds of beliefs that are not the Gileadian blueprint. So, Serena Joy, snip, eradicates them in a blitzkrieg or some kamikaze committed on the swelling genitalia of the flowers. So there's your intolerance, there's your hypocrisy, there's your genocide, really, of non-Gileadian ways of thinking or ideologies. Just stemming from that, stemming, flowers, growing, pun, oh dear. We have an important change here, I think. So if you've been following the videos and if you've been reading the novel, you'll see that the depiction of fertility, growing flowers, gardens, etc. have tended to be on a similar theme. However, this particular moment in chapter 25, I'm going to argue marks an important change in terms of this imagery and how it's used. So we've got here more references to growing and flowers and stuff. Indigo shadow and the bleeding hearts, so female in shape it was a surprise they'd not long since been rooted out. There is something subversive about this garden of Serena's, a sense of buried things bursting upwards wordlessly into the light, as if to point to say, whatever is silenced will clamour to be heard, though silently. So if you look over on the right here, I'm suggesting structurally, at this stage in the novel, a possible turning point in the nature imagery, not the failing or castrated killed fertility, but perhaps a foreshadowed challenge to power through nature. Or, if you go with this idea of a repressive totalitarian regime, dystopian fiction, new right ideology, we've said before, attempts to suppress, silence, control and defeat seem to sort of engender or create or lead to, naturally, resentment, rebellion, uprising. So there seems to be a bit of hope and optimism here that despite these tyrants, these despots, these regimes, your Trumps and your kind of totalitarian world leaders, despite their attempts to control, they can never fully eradicate, or perhaps because of their attempt to control and eradicate, rebellion. I think Attwood would say, thankfully, rebellion is caused by, or arises out of, or is engendered by such attempts to repress and control and defeat. There's something sort of indomitable about the human spirit of maybe oppressed peoples that defeat is not guaranteed. That spirit of rebelliousness will always survive. Okay, another Gilead Nazi parallel here, and also speaking to this idea of the homogeneity of people sort of made into sort of copies of each other, all identical through new right ideology. She, Serena Joy, stays in the sitting room knitting away at her endless angel scarves, turning out more and more yards of intricate and useless wool people. Her form of procreation, it must be. So if we're into the idea of remaking man into homogeneous copies of perfection, then we're getting towards Hitler's Aryan ideal, aren't we? Model citizens, identical drones and slaves of perfection as determined by the totalitarian regime. However, you've got that, and we've seen the wool people knitted before, and we've seen ideas of homogeneity before, but in this chapter you can see here it's juxtaposed with what Attwood, I think, is positioning or offering as an equally damaging form of ideology. So she's got access to Vogue magazines now from her illicit encounters with the commander. So what this allows Attwood to do is have a very sort of satirical critique and reflection on the periods that in 1985 readership are very aware of, the sort of damaging ideologies about perfection and body image fed to her readers from these eras. It's their generation. So neither of these ideologies are being held up as a desirable or preferable imprint or blueprint for mankind, and specifically women, to follow. Both are critiqued. So let's have a little look at some of the reflections here on the Vogue magazine. What was in them was promise. They dealt in transformations. They suggested an endless series of possibilities, extending like the reflections in two mirrors set facing one another, stretching on, replica after replica, to the vanishing point. So if you're a student of media or film, you'll know the term mise on a beam, a mirror text. I've also got something down the bottom here. This is something postmodernists call a simulacra or simulacrum, a copy upon a copy where the original can no longer be identified. They suggested one adventure after another, one wardrobe after another, one improvement after another, one man after another. They suggested rejuvenation, pain overcome and transcended, endless love. The real promise in them was immortality. So very much an invitation from Atwood here for a contemporary reader of then to reflect on the damage being done by this ideology. This also speaks brilliantly to when we get into Jezebels later on. This idea of one adventure, one wardrobe, one improvement, one man after another is shown when you see the choices of uniforms, if that's the right word to use, the choice of dress or appearance, I guess, that the women who reside in Jezebels choose. So we're getting towards the damage of the sort of Barbie myth. So cheerleader Barbie, high school physicist Barbie, whatever sort of identity is available from those patriarchal sanctioned outfits that men find desirable in Jezebels. So equally damaging to female identity here is the time before Gilead have taken control, but obviously the massive damage that Gilead has also done to women during its occupation and its rule. As I've discussed before in certain parts of other videos as well, don't see these two time zones as entirely distinct or separate. So the time before Gilead promised these false goals and this unobtainable sort of happiness from the glossy magazines. Then you have Gilead and its form of unobtainable perfection and happiness as well. However, I think Atwood wants you to see these two things as linked. So the damage being done to women from the 60s, 70s and 80s is obviously held up there as damaging. However, I think she wants you to see some kind of link that if we don't look at how we live in the now, 60s, 70s and 80s obviously, then it sort of gives rise to groups like the New Right to come and demonise, seek control, obtain power and eradicate and replace that with their own form of hellishness as well. This quote here, I guess, speaks to number 3 most of all, number 3 and number 5, certainly number 1 as well, in terms of power being subverted, with the idea of the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's the commander confiding in his mistress that his wife doesn't understand him. She wouldn't understand anyway. She won't talk to me much anymore. We don't seem to have much in common these days. And Offred notes it's, quote, the same old thing. So even though the times are abnormal, which is a quote I've pinched from chapter 24, male and female relationships still affected by the problems of the time before, it seems. So where's that going? Well, in a way, it just adds to the mockery of Gilead, really. It's supposed to be this utopia. They understand sacrifices have to be made, but there's nothing utopic about it. All this upheaval and change for not much improvement, it would seem. In the same way that impossible ideals of beauty have re-entered Offred's mind now through the Vogue magazine, we also get the return of another unwelcome friend, another thing that feminist criticism rightly identifies and critiques, the male gaze. It returns to Offred's life here. He watched me smoothing it over my hands and then my face with the same air of looking in through the bars. I wanted to turn my back on him. It was as if he were in the bathroom with me, but I didn't dare. For him, I must remember, I am only a whim. So she's used to surveillance. It is, a dystopian, totalitarian sort of prison, really. But in a double sense now, she's under that extra scrutiny, which is sort of invasive and extremely unwelcome. We see that now in this chapter 26 quote as well. Thanks for watching this Lit in 5 video on these chapters of The Handmaid's Tale. There are plenty of other videos I've made on The Handmaid's Tale, doing similar walkthroughs of the chapters, looking at language and contexts. If you found this useful, please please add some comments, please give us some feedback, what you'd like to see more of, less of, subscribe to the channel. Best of British.